Montgomery, Alabama, April of 1969. Inside the Montgomery Coliseum, the air felt like a heavy velvet curtain, thick, not with fan screams or hot lights, but with a tension that had no tidy name. The Deep South was only a year removed from Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. And tonight, Elvis Presley would walk on stage with 4 black women, the Sweet Inspirations. 35,000 people formed an unmoving sea. Some came to witness the king, some came to make a point they rarely said aloud in daylight. Midway through Suspicious Minds, it happened. A voice hurled a slur from the dark, a blade of sound slicing the night. The band seized up. The music died. Silence detonated. That instant split the evening in two. Elvis, who'd grown up in Tupelo, listening to black radio and worshipping in black churches, whose art rose from blues and gospel, stood at a fork: keep the South comfortable, or do what was right. His answer would change page 1 headlines the next day and bend the futures of the 4 women behind him. To grasp Montgomery, you have to widen to America in 1969. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were ink on paper that hadn't yet soaked into hearts. After April 1968, cities burned. The National Guard deployed. Backlash against integration swelled. Especially in the Deep South, Montgomery wasn't just any city. It was where Rosa Parks kept her seat in 1955, where Dr. King led a bus boycott that rewrote history. By 1969, the town carried pride in its past and resentment for change forced upon it. So when Elvis's tour slated Montgomery and spotlighted black performers, an old fuse finally met a flame. Elvis had always occupied a strange place in America's racial politics. To some, a bridge; to others, a thief. In his 1969 live return, he did not hire the Sweet Inspirations to disappear into the mix. They wore dazzling, matching gowns, were lit and heard as artists, not shadows. Colonel Tom Parker warned, "Don't feature them so boldly, you'll lose tickets in some markets." Elvis refused. The Sweet Inspirations were not just any backing group. Cissy Houston was already a gospel soul force. Her daughter, Whitney, would one day become a legend. With Cissy stood Myrna Smith, Sylvia Shemwell, and Estelle Brown, professionals who had sung for Aretha Franklin and Wilson Pickett, women who had paid their dues in rooms where black artists were too often treated as second class. Even as their music moved the nation before the tour, they talked it through if heckled, ignore or answer if things turned ugly. They knew the South's beauty and brutality, and that an integrated stage would wrinkle some brows. In Montgomery, security was tightened, not for a specific threat, but because everyone understood how dry the air was, how easily a spark could catch. Backstage, Elvis was quieter than usual. Bandmates later said he joked less, fidgeted less, his gaze slipping between past and present. Maybe he sensed something, or maybe the weight of playing Montgomery with an integrated band pressed on him. The Sweet Inspirations warmed up, checked gowns, pretending this was just another night, knowing it wasn't. The first half ran like water before a storm. Elvis opened hot. The arena rose. The band was iron tight. The Sweet Inspirations wrapped his lead in bright, warm harmony. By Suspicious Minds, the show had reached cruising speed. Then, in a breath of instrumental space, the slur tore through the song. Elvis stopped mid-phrase. The mic fell to his side. The sweet inspirations froze on Myrna's face, a tear poised to break. They had met racism before, but rarely before a crowd this vast. The band looked around. 35,000 held their breath. The hush rustled. Then went absolute. Elvis walked to the lip of the stage. No huddle, no glance to the wings. The spotlights clung to him as if gravity had changed. His voice was controlled. Trembling with anger, "Stop right there." He turned toward the four women. "They are not just my backup, they are artists. Colleagues, friends, family." The word family hit the stage like a stone. In 1969, Dixie enough, by itself, to upset an old order. Then he drew a line. There are the exits. If you can't give them the respect they deserve, please leave. The night stood still. A solitary clap. Then more. Then a swell. Pockets stayed seated. Arms folded. A few hundred rose and walked. Their muttering dragging across the concrete like a chair leg. No one in that hall knew what would come next. Under the harsh white lights, Elvis stood, microphone in hand, his eyes sweeping across the packed arena. Some in the crowd looked away, others clenched their fists on the armrests. The air was so thick that everyone could hear their own heartbeat. Then Elvis spoke again, his voice trembling, but firm. "These women aren't just part of my show. They are the show. And more than that, they're human beings who deserve respect." The words fell like a church bell through silence. Then he drew a deep breath. "I can see the exits right there. If you can't listen without hate in your heart, if you can't show them the respect they deserve, then please leave. Because this stage, this music, doesn't belong only to people who look like me. It belongs to all of us." He wasn't shouting, yet every syllable struck like a hammer against the stone walls of the South in 1969, where equality was still a fragile dream. For a long second, the crowd froze. Then one person clapped, then another, and another. The ripple became a wave. Thousands stood, cheering, crying, yet some stayed seated, faces hard. A few hundred rose, muttering, and stormed out. And then from somewhere in the back, someone began to sing, "We Shall Overcome." The hymn of the civil rights movement rose through the air, faint at first, then gathering strength. Elvis's eyes glistened. The sweet inspirations joined in. And then he did too, his rough southern voice blending with thousands. It wasn't rehearsed. It was revelation. It was no longer a concert, it was communion. When the last note faded, Elvis wiped his eyes and whispered to his band, "We're not finishing Suspicious Minds." He turned to the sweet inspirations. "What do you want to sing?" Cissy Houston stepped forward, consulted the others, then told him quietly. Elvis nodded. "All right," he said, "let's change it." And then the king stepped back. For the first time, Elvis Presley ceded the spotlight. The sweet inspirations began "People Get Ready," Curtis Mayfield's gospel classic of freedom and faith. They sang with every wound they'd ever carried. Each note trembled in the still air like confession, like prayer. Elvis stood behind them, head bowed, silent, sometimes adding a soft harmony, simply bearing witness. When the song ended, the Colosseum erupted. The ovation lasted minutes. People stood on seats, clapping through tears. Myrna Smith later said, "It was the most powerful moment of my life. For once, I wasn't just seen, I was acknowledged." The rest of the show changed tone. Elvis kept singing, But the light felt different. It was no longer entertainment, it was testimony. Between songs, he told stories about his Mississippi childhood, about the black neighbors who taught him to sing, about his mother Gladys working beside black women, sharing lunches and laughter. He didn't preach. He remembered, and people listened. They met a different Elvis that night, not a star, but a man. News spread like fire. The next morning, the Montgomery Advertiser ran the headline, "Elvis takes stand on race." By week's end, papers from New York to Los Angeles echoed the story. Southern radio split, some cheered, some condemned. A few venues cancelled upcoming shows. Colonel Parker raged. But Elvis stayed calm. "If fairness costs me fans," he said, "maybe I need to lose them." Letters flooded Graceland, 60% full of gratitude, 40% of anger. Some carried threats, too vile to print. Yet something else shifted. The sweet inspirations. Once background voices became stars. They were invited to interviews, magazine covers, recording sessions. In the industry, white artists began speaking up, pointing to the night in Montgomery as proof that silence was no longer acceptable. After Montgomery, the fallout came faster than anyone expected. Northern newspapers hailed Elvis Presley as the man who turned a concert into a declaration of human dignity. But in the South, radio stations quietly dropped his records. A few venues cancelled his bookings. Some local papers sneered. Elvis forgot who he was. Colonel Tom Parker was furious. He didn't oppose Elvis's message, he feared the consequences. "You don't know what you've just done," Parker barked, pacing backstage. "You could lose half of America." Elvis simply replied, softly but firmly, "If the other half stays for the right reason, that's enough." Letters flooded Graceland, hundreds of praises, hundreds of curses. One note, written in shaky blue ink, "Read Elvis." My boy cried, because you taught him what respect means. But others came laced with hate, death threats, even bullets wrapped in newspaper. The FBI was alerted. Security around Elvis doubled overnight. The sweet inspirations were no longer background voices. They had become symbols. TV shows wanted interviews. Magazines printed their stories, and record labels sent offers. But what they remembered most was the look in Elvis's eyes when he said, "They are my family." It was the look of a man willing to pay the price. Elvis understood what that price meant. Born in Tupelo, raised in the conservative South. His core audience was white, middle-aged, and wary of politics in music. And yet he, the son of that same South, had stood before them and drawn a moral line. Elvis wasn't an activist. He didn't march or preach. He simply acted when conscience demanded. Sometimes, that's all it takes to change history. After Montgomery, he began speaking more openly about his musical roots. In interviews, he mentioned Arthur Big Boy Crudup, the black man whose "That's All Right Elvis" had reimagined. He spoke of Big Mama Thornton, who first sang Hound Dog. "I didn't invent rock, roll," Elvis said. "I just brought it to people who hadn't heard it yet." It wasn't an apology. It was acknowledgement, and in 1969 America, that meant everything. His bond with the sweet inspirations deepened. Untold. They became friends. Elvis asked about their lives, their families, their pain. Cissy Houston recalled, he didn't say much. But when he went quiet, you knew he was thinking. when her little girl Whitney began singing in church. Elvis once told her, "Keep that voice safe. Cissy, that girl's gonna go further than you ever did." And he was right. But courage has a cost beyond threats. It's loneliness. After Montgomery, Elvis grew withdrawn. He became convinced extremists might retaliate. Security tightened. Friends said he began living inside a cage of fear, a cage built of fame and paranoia. Biographers later suggested that this isolation fed his dependence on sedatives, his retreat from public life. Because sometimes, the bravest people carry the deepest scars when the crowd falls silent. Yet Montgomery remained the night he never regretted. When asked years later, Elvis simply said, "I didn't save anyone. But I know I didn't stay quiet." Half a century later, that sentence still echoes like a chord that never fades. To understand the weight of Montgomery, one must place it in the frame of 1969, the year of Woodstock, the year of Stonewall, when youth across America rose against the old order. But Elvis Presley was no longer a rebel teenager. He was 34. A man who had served in the army, believed in God, and was raised under the conservative code of the South. That's what made his stand in Montgomery different. It wasn't rebellion, it was awakening. Elvis never tried to profit from that moment. He refused to let the media turn it into political theater. Yet audiences never forgot. For them, it wasn't a disrupted concert. It was the night a cultural icon chose conscience over applause. In the months that followed, Elvis quietly donated to civil rights scholarships. When asked why he didn't make it public, he smiled. "I don't want what's right to look like a publicity stunt." Cissy Houston later said, after Montgomery, Elvis listened more. He spoke less. But when injustice came up, he didn't walk away anymore. The sweet inspirations were no longer employees. They were family. They ate together, rehearsed together, laughed through exhaustion. Elvis often said, "Without them, half my soul's missing." But behind the scenes, Colonel Parker was struggling. Promoters in Texas, Louisiana, and Georgia started hesitating. Some called with coded language, "We love Elvis." But folks down here are sensitive. Parker knew what that meant. He urged Elvis to let it blow over. Elvis answered, "If they won't hear me sing beside people I respect, then I've got nothing worth singing." Ironically, Montgomery cost Elvis a slice of the South, but earned him something deeper elsewhere: respect. Northern journalists praised him as an artist who placed morality above money. A Boston paper wrote, "The night music became a prayer for justice." Years later, music historians would call that night a turning point when entertainers realized they could shape culture beyond the stage. After Montgomery, more white performers spoke out against racial injustice. If Elvis had the guts to do it, Tom Jones said in 1971, "then so can I." For Elvis, Montgomery became a mirror. He knew he was called the king of rock and roll, but he also knew that Crown stood on black foundations. He didn't deny it anymore. At every concert, he introduced the sweet inspirations with respect, naming each woman, telling stories about gospel and soul as if reminding the crowd, "This music isn't just mine, it's ours." Time passed. Elvis kept touring, kept smiling, but his friends noticed a new gravity in him. The night in Montgomery wasn't just a moment, it was a shift of spirit. He began talking about responsibility, faith, and the pain of a divided nation. When a reporter once asked, "Do you think that night changed history?" Elvis smiled softly. "I just think it changed one man, and that man was me." As the years wore on and cracks began to show through his weary voice, the memory of Montgomery stayed with him, a small light, reminding him that sometimes a single act of courage can make an entire life worthwhile. Because history, in the end, isn't written by those who play it safe, but by those who dare to say no when silence feels easier. More than half a century has passed since that April night of 1969 in Montgomery. Yet its echo still lingers. People still speak of Elvis Presley not only as the king of rock and roll, but as the man who dared to lift his voice above the noise of prejudice, who chose justice over silence. The sweet inspirations, those 4 women who stood behind him that night, still recall it with tears in their eyes. He didn't just defend us. He defended the soul of the music itself. For them, Montgomery wasn't a concert, it was redemption through courage. Historians still debate whether Elvis was a civil rights hero. Maybe that question misses the point. Heroes aren't perfect. They're simply those who stand when it matters. Elvis Presley didn't save the world. He didn't end racism. But he did save something else, his own integrity. And perhaps that's the greatest victory any artist can claim, not applause, not crowns, but the peace of looking in the mirror without shame. Today, when old footage of Elvis plays, millions who weren't even born when he died pause at those simple words, "These women are my family." A short sentence that carried the weight of a nation's wound. Montgomery is no longer a painful scar. It's proof that real strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers the truth when the world stays silent, because sometimes one person's courage is enough to remind the crowd how long they've been quiet. And Elvis, bathed in white light before 35,000 witnesses, chose the hardest thing to do what was right. Even if it cost him everything. If you're watching this video, remember, you don't have to be a legend to do what's right. Every small act of conscience adds a verse to the song of history. Leave a comment below. If you were Elvis that night, what would you have done? Do you believe one brave moment can still change the world? And if this story touched your heart, hit super thanks to support our channel and help us keep telling the untold stories of those who dared to stand for what's right. Because sometimes one voice is all it takes to make the world listen.